And with that being said, I'll go ahead and get us started. Before we begin, we will start with our land acknowledgement. So we want to acknowledge that the land that we stand on and place that we call Cuyahoga County is land that was claimed by the United States government through force, displacement, and treaties negotiated in bad faith. We acknowledge those of the Shawnee, Miami, Erie, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose lands we stand on, and the thousands of Native Americans representing over 100 tribes who currently live in Northeast Ohio today. We thank the Lake Erie Native American Council for helping us develop this acknowledgement. We also want to take a moment to share that CAC values equity. We choose to lead with racial equity in our work because the creation and perpetuation of racial inequities is embedded into government and grant making. We confront the white supremacy that resides in our work because racial inequities across all indicators of success are deep and pervasive. We also recognize the power and the potential that organizations who produce arts and cultural programming have as bearers of culture. These institutions have power to write the narrative about who belongs and who is valued. We encourage arts organizations to connect with resources to advance equity in your own work. Please visit cacgrants.org/equity or contact a grants manager to learn more. We also will drop the link in the chat for you guys. So again, if you're just joining us, we invite you to introduce yourselves using the chat function. Again, this is the application workshop for Project Support 2026. However, I'd like to briefly introduce our team. With us today, we'll have Jake Sinatra, our Director of Grant Making, Strategy and Communications, Laura Matteo, who is our Communications Manager, Elisa Gottner, not pictured, but she is a Cleveland Foundation intern who will be joining us for the summer. And we have two grant managers, myself, Davon Nichols, and Maya, who will be presenting the workshop with you today. Each grant manager has a grant portfolio of about 100 organizations that we work with throughout the grant cycle. So please reach out to us if you're unsure who your grant manager is. If you are a returning grantee and you already have a grant manager assigned to you, who is your primary contact at CAC, um, you will already know who your grant manager is. But if you are a first-time applicant, feel free to reach out to any of us and we'll be happy to assist you. A grant manager will be assigned at the new applications once you've been completed through the application process. And we'll leave a link in the chat for you guys to access the grant manager's contact information. So at this time, if you're not aware, the application has been available since early May for all future applicants. So in this workshop, we'll talk about the program goals and the general overview of project support, the funding criteria, the application, and next steps for the application. We'll also hold time at the end for questions if you have any. Feel free to drop them in the chat as we move along, and we'll reference back to them once we have time at the end. The content that we discussed today comes directly from CAC's 2026 Project Support Guidelines. This document outlines the grant cycle and serves as the roadmap for the entire grant process. It's approved by CAC's board and is shared publicly with applicants and panelists. I encourage you all to give it a close read as you're getting ready to work on your application. And in the chat, we'll drop the Project Support Guidelines for your reference. The purpose of Cuyahoga Arts and Culture's Project Support Grant Program is to promote public access and encourage the breadth of arts and cultural programming in our community by supporting Cuyahoga County-based organizations and projects. We define a project as a specific connected set of activities with a beginning and an end, explicit goals, objectives, and a predetermined cost that does not equal the organization's annual budget. Project support is a matching grant, and all project support grants can be 50% in-kind match. Arts and culture is defined in the Ohio Revised Code, Chapter 3381, CAC's enabling law as including, but not limited to, literature, theater, music, dance, ballet, painting, sculpture, photography, motion pictures, archaeology, architecture, history, and natural sciences. I'll highlight that CEC's definition of arts and culture includes natural history and natural sciences. This means that we fund historical science and nature-based programming, in addition to other disciplines like musical, performing arts, and visual arts. A few areas that do not fit within our definition of arts and culture include things like yoga, language classes, apologies, martial arts, and it's fine if projects include some of these activities, but it's primarily for the arts and culture project to be by our definition. Projects must meet this definition, and your grant manager will be happy to seek or will speak to you if you have any questions regarding this. So to be eligible for the 2026 Project Support Grant, application organizations must meet all of the following eligibility criteria. One, be a 501c3 nonprofit organization as verified against the IRS Publication 78 by Go Verify service. Have a permanent and viable base of operations in Cuyahoga County for at least 1 year prior to July 31st, 2025. Have produced or presented arts or cultural programming in Cuyahoga County open to the public within the previous 2 years prior to July 31st, 2025. Provide the required financial documents. So all organizations have 990, 990N, or 990Z for the most recently completed fiscal year. Incorporated must be incorporated and authorized to do business in Ohio as verified by the Ohio Secretary of State. Within these eligibility requirements, many of the organizations that receive CAC funding do not have a primary mission of arts and culture, but are doing amazing arts and cultural programming through their work. So current and past grant recipients have included community development corporations, after-school programs, and mental health agencies, as well as organizations that focus only on arts and cultural programming. For a list of types of organizations who are ineligible to apply, please see our guidelines. Some examples include private non-operating foundations, units of government, fundraising organizations such as friends of or groups. Again, see the guidelines for the full list and contact us if you have any questions. So for an application to be approved to go to Plano, it must meet our definition of a project. Projects may be one-time events, such as a festival or exhibit, or a clearly connected series of events, such as a roster of classes or a series of productions. Projects must start and end with the 2026 calendar year. Each project needs a distinct start and end date that falls within the calendar year, but is not the full year. Projects must be arts or cultural activities with a public programming component. We'll talk more about how we define arts and culture throughout the application, but please refer to us if you have any questions regarding that. Projects must take place in Cuyahoga County. They must be open to the public, but open to the public doesn't mean that the project or the program has to be free. It just needs to be a program that can and will be advertised broadly, welcoming visitors. CAC project support projects must have a public programming component or some part of your project open to the Cuyahoga County residents. Some examples could include public concerts, events, activities, festivals, etc., open to county residents. Alternatively, your project can feature public programming around a public display of arts and culture programming of the arts and culture component of your project. For example, a mural by itself would not be an eligible project because it doesn't include a public programming component. There will also need to be an event that was open to the public, or maybe a series of workshops led by the muralist that is open to the public, where some type of public programming must be included for the project to be considered eligible. If you have any questions about the component and how it applies to your specific project, please view the guidelines, and contact us for further assistance. So next, we're going to talk about the CAC grant request amounts and budgets. The 2026 project support offers grants up to $5,000 or up to $7,500, as determined by the organization's CAC grant history and budget size. And the budget size is determined in the applicant's IRS 990 filing. You may request any amount up to the maximum amounts listed here. Regardless of either of the maximum amount requests, please note that your request cannot be more than half of the overall project. For example, if you apply for a grant of $5,000, then you must submit a project with a budget of at least $10,000 to be eligible to request that amount. For new applicants or applicants who have not received funding from CAC since 2021, applicants who file an IRS 990N in their most recently completed fiscal year can request an amount up to $5,000. Returning applicants who filed an IRS Form 990 or 990EZ in their most recently completed fiscal year can request an amount up to $7,500. So here are a few pictures from some events and activities that we've supported in the past. We're excited to hear your 2026 projects. We talked so far about the technical requirements and restrictions of project support, but in this next section, we'll be diving into the application process and how your organization can be successful in this step. I want to acknowledge that this was a lot of information, so we're going to hold time at the end for questions. If you have any questions that are coming up right now, please feel free to add them to the chat, and we'll reference back to them at the end. And now I'll hand it over to Maya for our funding criteria and application process information.
Great, thank you, Devon. Okay, so CAC's funding criteria are public benefit, artistic and cultural vibrancy, and organizational capacity. Public benefit carries the most weight in the grant review process. Funding criteria are important to consider when working on your application because panelists will assess all parts of your application against the funding criteria. They are the rubric that your application is reviewed, and the funding criteria ensure that all applications are judged by the same standards. If your application shows sufficient evidence of meeting CAC's funding criteria, you will be eligible for funding. As you're working on the application, take the time to read through the full definitions of each of the funding criteria in the program guidelines. There's a clear link between our funding criteria and the application. So to help applicants show they're meeting the requirements of our funding, all our funding criteria should thread through your entire application, but there are a few key questions and sections that address the criteria directly. It's a good idea to have the funding criteria page of the guidelines handy when you're writing your application. The panelists will be doing the same thing when they review the application. So let's spend a few minutes to cover each of the funding criteria and talk about where and how you might address each of them in your application. And so first we'll start with public benefit, which is an organization's ability to meaningfully connect with its community through its project. A few examples of public benefit might be inviting neighbors to serve on an advisory board, marketing the program broadly, or training volunteers to ensure all participants feel welcome. In the application, there are a few questions directly referencing public benefit. We ask you to define your community and how will you connect with your community through your project? How will you be inclusive and foster belonging for all people? When answering the first question about community, you can show that you truly know your organization's community by being specific. A community may be defined by geography, identity, or affinity. Every project will be serving a different community, and your community is very unlikely to be all of Cuyahoga County. A strong project is one that centers its community, but is welcoming and inclusive of the wider public. In the second question, you can speak to how your organization's programming is inviting to a wider scope of people. How is the programming a place that anyone can feel welcome and that they belong? Next is artistic and cultural vibrancy. This is our second criteria. It is an organization's ability to create a relevant and engaging project. This is not the same as artistic excellence or artistic quality. We intentionally don't use those terms as they are very subjective. In the application, you'll have the opportunity to address this throughout the application. Some examples of how an organization can demonstrate artistic and cultural vibrancy might be building the capacity of arts and cultural professionals, helping them to thrive, incorporating a process of reflection to ensure that programming is relevant to or created with its community. This may look like surveys, research, or communicating with targeted communities to gain different perspectives. Engaging a diverse team of arts and cultural professionals qualified to achieve the mission while complying with all applicable anti-discrimination law. And then the third criteria is organizational capacity. It is an organization's ability to successfully manage resources. This will also be addressed throughout the application. And some examples of how an organization can demonstrate organizational capacity include, but are not limited to, setting goals, measuring progress and evolving, recruiting and retaining a diverse staff and board that can carry out the mission while complying with applicable anti-discrimination law, and then planning strategically to achieve and maintain a strong financial position, which you can really demonstrate in the project budget section. An example question associated with this criteria is describe your team and include who will be involved and how they are qualified. And so I've mentioned belonging a couple times now, and we define belonging and several other important terms in our glossary, which is linked in the guidelines and we can share now as well. Words like diverse, sharing power, community, and others. Belonging is about an unwavering commitment to not simply tolerating and respecting difference, but to ensure that all people are welcome and feel that they belong in a given space. This graphic, which comes from the John A. Powell and the Othering and Belonging Institute, is a great example of that. Belonging is not just about inviting people into the circle, but expanding it and bringing in more chairs. It is about bridging between differences and not requiring people to change or integrate. It's about co-creating and co-owning. In organizations and institutions, this concept should be present at all levels, not just in an education or outreach department, but especially in leadership where power is held. Belonging in practice will look different in every organization, but it will not include tokenizing people of color, extractive partnerships with smaller organizations, or outreach programs into communities where you have no trusting relationships built. Applications that don't demonstrate understanding and respect for their community will not be recommended for funding, and organizations that cultivate belonging throughout their work will be able to demonstrate strong connection to our funding criteria. Okay, so we're moving on to the 2026 project support application process. The project support guidelines, which we will drop in the chat if we haven't already, remember that panelists are looking for evidence of the funding criteria throughout your entire application. We start the application with the organizational overview, which includes your mission statement, organizational history, and contact information. Then you move on to the eligibility check section of the application. This is where you confirm your core mission, authorization to do business, base of operations, demographics, 990 submission, and your organizational budget and proof of programming. After that is the project basics. This is where you share your project details such as title, dates, location, and participant information like the number of expected participants and if it's free or not. Next is the project narratives. This is where you connect your project to our funding criteria. Those are the questions we just went over in the last few slides before this. And then the project budget and financials. Here you will share your request amount and your plans to raise matching income. You don't need to have these income sources committed or in the bank at the time of the application, but your plan should be detailed enough to inspire confidence that your organization can meet the matching requirement. And then finally, there's the support materials. Support materials enhance the narrative and help bring your project to life and are very important for the application. They can be images, videos, links to online pages, survey results, letters of support, or anything else that can help a panelist understand your organization or project. Panelists will review up to 3 support materials, so don't overload them with information. So as an example, if you are putting on a production or a play, you don't need to include the entire script. But do bring your project or organization to life by creating a photo collage rather than one photo, for example. Consider how you can demonstrate the 3 funding criteria, especially public benefit, in your chosen support materials. Support materials are important application components that are worth your time and effort to consider. We have an FAQ sheet about both linked on the last page of the guidelines that can help with these pieces that I recommend looking at when you get there. And I think we'll drop the link for the support materials. So what can CAC funds be used for? This is important to keep in mind as you're preparing the budget that will be proposed along with your project. In addition to direct costs like artist fees, supplies, marketing materials, your CAC grant can include administrative costs and logistics like permits and security. Costs for things that can help facilitate your arts and culture project are acceptable. CAC grants cannot be used for receptions, international travel, activities outside of Cuyahoga County, or components of your project that don't relate to arts and culture. For example, the bouncy house at a street festival. It's not arts and culture and not a necessary tool to produce the arts and culture component. It's okay if these are part of your project, but they cannot be covered by CAC funds. The CAC guidelines have a comprehensive list of funding restrictions, so be sure to review it. And then PS grants are matching grants, which means grantees must match the CAC grant with other funds. Up to half of the match can be in kind. Matching funds can come from other grants, donations, ticket sales, member dues, but may not come from CAC through other grants or another organization CAC grants. So here's a screenshot from the application of the project support income table. As you can see, on the left-hand side, there are pre-populated categories that help to consolidate various income sources you may have. On the right-hand side, you will list the dollars you expect to raise for your project, the funds you will use to match your CAC request amount. In the first row of the income amount you provide, you will state your CAC grant request amount. Please keep in mind that the request amount cannot be more than 50% of the proposed project's total expenses. And this is a one-to-one match in funds. So for example, if you can only demonstrate income of $2,000 towards your project, CAC will only award up to $2,000. Any in-kind donations can be 50% of your match funds, as I mentioned. So taking that $2,000 example, you could choose to budget for in-kind income, such as volunteer hours, donated goods or services, for up to $1,000. And then we'll move on to the expense table. So here's a screenshot from the application for the project support expense table. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there are pre-populated categories that list common eligible expense categories for project support recipients. On the right-hand side, you will list where your dollars are expected to be spent. However, keep in mind that project support grant amounts cannot be more than half of the expenses. So for example, if your CAC grant amount is anticipated to be $4,000, you must show at least $8,000 in total expenses. Any in-kind donations noted in your income statement may be included here as well. Notice how there is an other project expenses category listed here. This will serve for you to include the total amounts for expenses that may not fit within the already provided eligible expense categories, like security and permits mentioned in the previous slide. I know that this is a change from previous ones, so that's why I just wanted to highlight that really quickly. Okay. Project support applications are due on Thursday, July 31st at 4:30 p.m. Late and incomplete applications will not be accepted. Once applications are submitted, grant managers complete a first review of project support applications to make sure they're eligible to go to panel. The next step is panel review. We invite panelists of experts to review applications in online panels by providing written feedback for all eligible project support applications. Panelist scores are based on how projects meet the funding criteria. Most organizations receive a percentage of their request amount. However, applicants who demonstrate weak evidence that the funding criteria are met will not be recommended for funding. Panel scores and reviews are expected to be completed by the end of September, and all organizations will be informed of the results soon after. Those scores and recommendations are then approved at the regular meeting of our Board of Trustees, which is typically held in November. After funding recommendations are approved by the board, the 2026 grant year begins on January 1st and ends December 31st. CAC grants are reimbursement grants, but you may receive up to 60% of your grant before you complete your project by submitting an advance payment request. All grantees will submit a final report, which is due 30 days after the project is complete, to receive your grant payment or the remainder of your grant payment. We also understand projects can change between application period and implementation, or even once the planning process begins. For any changes to your project after you're recommended for funding, please contact the CAC team for approval first. Again, as a reminder, you can find this information and more in our 2026 guidelines documents. So before we close and move to questions, we just want to highlight that we offer application office hours. Office hours are hosted by our team to help with the application process and requirements. This is an informal space just for applicants to help answer any final questions as you complete your application. You are always welcome to reach out to your grant manager with any questions you might have outside of these hours. And we'll drop the events and deadlines. Thank you. Great. And with that, we thank you for joining us today and welcome any questions you may have.